Hi, I'm Johnny Lewis, and I want to thank you for allowing me to present to you about a collaborative professional culture. First, I want to talk about what that means. What do we mean when we say a collaborative professional culture? A healthy professional learning culture is a culture that is where teachers are in a constant dialogue about curriculum, teaching, learning, and assessment, and it occurs among all of the staff together professionally, and they contribute to developing an understanding and reflection. So imagine the idea that staff are kind of constantly in this dialogue about what education really means, what the heart of what we're trying to do as educators is, and we're giving one another positive and constructive feedback consistently. And for many of us who have been part of schools or who are leading schools, when we think about moving toward this kind of culture, there are these different phases of professional learning cultures that schools have to work themselves through. And depending on what kind of culture has been in the building, among the staff, we could land at any one of these different phases. And so kind of the beginning phase, the opposite of a collaborative culture, is a toxic culture. That's where people are negative about the work and negative about the building and about the culture of the school, where teachers are kind of divided and independent. The second would be an individual or fragmented phase of school culture. So imagine a place where teachers aren't necessarily negative about their school, but they kind of do their own thing, and there's no partnership or collaboration about what's going on in the building. It's just kind of you control your world and I'll control mine. And then kind of the balkanized phase of school culture, where we're moving a little bit more toward collaboration, is when we're kind of divided by department or by educational philosophy. So, teachers who teach science or math kind of do their thing, and English does another, and everybody's kind of separated from one another in that way. And then as we move kind of more toward collaboration, the next step would be contrived, and that's where collegiality feels a little more shallow, where we're not having deep conversations, but we are kind of the leadership of the building is kind of encouraging people to have some conversation with one another to move toward this, and it's possible that we may have to be at the contrived level before we can get to collaborative school culture. And then the next one will be comfortable. That's where we talk with one another, and maybe we give one another ideas, but there's no constructive feedback, there's no honest dialogue, and it's more kind of everybody's positive and not thinking as much about growth. And then where we want to be, and the kind of cultures we want to create in our school for our district and in our own building, is to be a collaborative culture where teachers are partners with one another, where they're involved in making big decisions about the school culture, and we work as teams, where we're able to give one another ideas, where we're able to see each other teach and give constructive criticism and feedback of one another, so that we're all working toward growth, and we're kind of away from this sort of territorial fear of vulnerability. And so some signs that you would see that would tell you that your school has a collaborative school culture would be that, number one, you need to know what the school vision and mission is. It needs to be front and center. It needs to be discussed often, and then that needs to drive teaching philosophy for every teacher in the building, all educators kind of moving in the same direction. And then shared goal setting. Again, we're kind of all sharing goals together and developing them together. They're not coming from an authoritarian place. And then when you have peer-to-peer coaching with honest and constructive feedback, where it's expected and ingrained in the school culture, where it doesn't feel like anybody's out to get you, or also we're not worried about impressing one another. Every time we walk into our classroom, we're just worried about growing as educators. And so as we think about that, the next question for us to ask is, what can administrators do to help create this kind of environment? Some signs as administrators and some things we need to work toward to create this kind of collaborative culture. We need to invite teams to lead and to make decisions rather than our being authoritarian in our style. We need to develop leadership teams that are looking at data and making data-driven decisions, and based on feedback from students and hard data and feedback from families about the direction of the school. We're making those together. And so this kind of follows along. Then we're setting collaborative goals. We're not just making decisions, but we're setting goals and working toward them together. And then all of that, in order to make any of that happen, we have to have school capacity. And so what that means is, in order for teachers to really do this kind of collaborative work, there needs to be enough bandwidth. There needs to be time built into their schedule to see one another teach, to model teaching, to have these kinds of more in-depth and vulnerable conversations. This is not something where we can kind of accomplish collaborative professional culture with one 30-minute meeting a month. It needs to be much more ingrained than that. And so that takes time to do that. And so these are some ways that some administrators can do that effectively. One of them is to provide subs for half days, maybe once a quarter, to ensure there's time for that collaborative work, to give teachers time to work together, to provide extra time for teachers to do peer-to-peer observation, to be in and out of each other's classrooms while there are students in there, to create an agenda for teacher preparation once a week, so that encourages that dialogue. We create the agenda and say this is what's going to happen when we sit down together, and also it takes kind of the pressure off of teachers to figure out what it is they're supposed to be doing when they sit down together. Encouraging and providing means for teachers to attend conferences, to visit schools that are doing things in a positive way or in a way that we want to learn from, and professional development together. And then inviting teams who are doing what we want to be working toward, inviting them to share at school-wide staff meetings, letting our staff lead those kinds of meetings, and then encouraging all staff to leave their doors open and foster a transparent, collaborative environment. And I think part of that comes from leadership, creating a space where teachers feel safe being vulnerable. They don't feel like somebody's out to get them if they aren't perfect, but where we're able to kind of see and acknowledge our needs and areas for growth with one another. And so as we think about that, here are some best practices to consider. Teachers in professional collaborative cultures, teachers are developing the school vision together. It's a partnership. Teachers are problem solving on big picture issues. Often we think of those as being issues that only administrators think about. Attendance issues, how we can be more inclusive, partnership with the community. There are leadership teams of teachers thinking about these things instead of just expecting administrators to kind of tell everybody what we're going to do to solve those problems. And then teachers, based on that problem solving they do together, they're designing the professional learning time themselves, and they're redesigning curriculum together based on what they perceive the needs to be on other feedback. So we're not bringing in consultants or handing things down to teachers, but we're letting them lead. And again, this happens only when we provide extra time for teachers to work toward these things. And so, again, here's some other best practices. Professional learning needs to be coherent and focused. It doesn't need to be fragmented by department. There doesn't need to be a new plan every year that's different from last year's plan, but we need to be kind of understand what the vision is and working toward it. We need to address instructional practice and content knowledge that's going to improve student outcomes. So we're looking at data and thinking about how we can grow the data in a positive direction. We're working to know what teachers believe and what their practices are so that we can have a high level of teacher buy-in rather than just commanding things. We're having conversations with each other about how we can solve these issues together. Best practices for collaboration are school-based. They're embedded in the job. They're part of the job, and they're long-term. And when we talk about job embedded, I just want to highlight again, the key piece to that is providing time within the framework of the job for teachers to really live into this together. We cannot make this one more duty we kind of pile onto them and expect it to be successful. There has to be time, and there needs to be a way to provide extensive follow-up in teacher classrooms. And again, we come back to like providing the time and creating the culture. All of these things, in order for them to happen, they have to be actively supported by school administrators. And so with those things in mind, these are the sources that were used to create this presentation. Thank you.